Good evening, dear listener. However you have found your way here, whether beneath a soft blanket, seated on a late-night train, or lying still while the ceiling fan spins its slow circles, welcome. Tonight I want to tell you a story that has traveled through centuries. It is a tale dressed in Latin, embroidered with fear and sharpened by rumor. Jus Primae Noctis, the supposed rite of the first night. Before we step deeper, let me thank you for lending me your attention. If you enjoy wandering through history told in a gentle voice, consider leaving a kind gesture, a like, a follow, perhaps even a share, so these quiet stories can return to you again. But I must offer a warning as soft as the turning of a page. This story may be too intriguing to lull you into sleep. If your eyes stay open, that is no failure. It only means curiosity is stronger than rest. Imagine a medieval village on the evening of a wedding. The square is alive with torches sputtering in the breeze. Loaves rest in baskets, ale froths in mugs, and music from a fiddle winds through the air like a bright thread. Children chase each other around carts, laughing until their feet are dust-covered. The bride stands with cheeks flushed, her veil pinned with rosemary for protection, while the groom grips her hand so tightly it is almost a vow. Around them the villagers celebrate with joy, but joy is fragile, and at the edge of every smile there is a glance toward the hill where the castle rises. Its windows glow red with firelight, and above the feast hovers a whisper. Two men lean close by the well. One murmurs, the other stiffens. By the time the words ripple through the crowd, the whisper has grown teeth. It is said the Lord may claim the bride before her husband does. No proclamation is read, no soldier announces it, but rumor needs neither parchment nor trumpet. It moves like smoke, unseen, suffocating, impossible to grasp. Suddenly the music sounds thinner, the laughter strained. The groom drinks more heavily than before. The bride's mother knots another herb into her daughter's hair, lips moving with an extra prayer. The Lord does not have to descend from his hall. The thought that he could is enough. Where does such a story find its roots? Part of it lies in the merchant fee, a payment required when a daughter married. To the steward recording it, merchant was arithmetic, a number in a ledger balancing the manor's loss of a worker. To the family, it was an insult that turned love into debt. Parents told their children, "We could not wed until the Lord was paid." Over years, those words hardened. The Lord stood between us and our bed. A silver coin is easily forgotten, but the feeling that one's joy was owned by another lingers like a bruise. Another root lies in the bedding ceremony, a custom where neighbors escorted the couple to their chamber. They carried candles, sang blessings, sometimes even teased with crude jokes, before leaving the pair to their night. To us it feels like intrusion. To them it was protection, ensuring fertility and fortune. But travelers hearing the tale in fragments retold it darker. The crowd at the bed became the Lord at the door. A symbol turned into a suspicion, suspicion into a rumor, rumor into a tradition no one could prove, yet everyone feared. The church, too, lent voice. Marriage, priests declared, was a holy sacrament. Nothing should trespass its threshold. So when preachers sought examples of arrogance, they pointed to the tale of the Lord who broke that boundary. It was a sermon more than a record, but sermons repeated become memory. Later, reformers would wield the legend as proof of feudal corruption, and revolutionaries would sharpen it as a weapon against the nobility. Each retelling gave the rumor new life, until the absence of evidence mattered less than the presence of belief. Step with me onto the castle balcony. A lord stands with rings flashing, keys heavy at his belt, the keys to mills, ovens, fields, and bridges. Below him the village square glimmers like an ember. He may think only of tallies, taxes, or harvests, but he does not need to think of the wedding at all. His power is so complete that the villagers imagine his presence where he has not stepped. In a world where he owns so much, what prevents him from owning this as well? Rumor flourishes in the gap between what is and what could be. This, dear listener, is why the tale endures. Even without legal record, it feels believable. Lords controlled every corner of life. Why not the bed? Even if no parchment confirms it, The structure of feudal power made the rumour plausible. And plausibility is enough to haunt. Picture the wedding door again. The couple approaches hand in hand. The villagers cheer, but their eyes flick nervously toward the castle. A soldier shifts his stance. The mother prays. The bride breathes fast, uncertain what the night will bring. Behind the closed shutters of every house, families wonder whether the whisper will someday knock at their own door. Here is where our journey begins, at the threshold where love meets fear, where joy is shadowed by rumour. Over the next 15 chapters, we will follow this legend across archives and landscapes. We will open charters and find what is written and what is not. We will travel to Scotland and France, where the rumour learned new tongues. We will hear how priests thundered, how poets laughed, how rebels brandished the tale as proof of tyranny. We will not ask only whether the Lord truly had such a right, but why generations chose to believe he did. For now, let the music fade. Let the square empty. Let the torches burn down to ash. If your eyes grow heavy, close them. The story will remain, waiting like a candle in an archive. Tomorrow we will follow the rumour into parchment and dust, listening for the first echoes scratched in ink. Sleep if you can. The whisper is patient. The wedding square grows silent, dear listener. The torches sputter out one by one, leaving the smell of smoke and roasted grain in the night air. Laughter fades down narrow lanes. The bride and groom have closed their door, yet outside, the whisper still drifts like mist. To find out whether this rite of the first night was ever more than rumour, we must leave the music behind and walk into colder spaces, the archives. Here, beneath vaulted stone ceilings and the scent of dust, parchment waits like a sleeper who never stirs. If proof of such a rite exists, surely it will be written here. If the proof is missing, the silence itself may speak. Imagine a manorial chamber in the 13th century. A steward sits at a wooden desk. His quill scratches lines on parchment, the ink pooling in thick strokes. He does not think of love or fear. To him, the villagers are entries in a ledger. Martin, son of Hugh, fined for gathering firewood. Isabel, daughter of Simon, gave 2 hens and a day's labour. Joan, wife of Walter, paid for the use of the Lord's mill. And in column after column appears the same word, merchet. It is the fee a family pays when a daughter marries, to compensate the Lord for the loss of her labour and her fertility. To the clerk, merchet is arithmetic. To the family, it is humiliation. A father places coins on the steward's table and feels as though he is selling his own child. A bride overhears her parents counting silver on the eve of her wedding and wonders whether her joy belongs to her or to her lord. A groom mutters that before he may hold his wife, the Lord has already taken something unseen. Over years, the wound grows into words. People say, "We could not marry until the Lord was satisfied." Coins turn into stories, and stories sprout claws. A payment written in a book becomes a rumour spoken by firelight. The Lord claimed the first night. Now open another folio. Here is a bedding fee, a charge due when a couple begins their household. In some places, villagers celebrated by escorting the couple to their chamber. They carried candles, sang songs, sometimes tossed jokes sharp enough to sting. They left bread and wine by the bed as blessing. It was meant as protection, a way of ensuring community watched over the start of new life. But when retold, especially by strangers, the detail of villagers at the bed blurred into a story of a lord at the door. Memory is not precise. Misunderstanding gives rumour bones. Soon a custom of joy is remembered as an act of violation. Search the law books. They are bound in calfskin, heavy as stone, filled with Latin clauses. Turn the pages. You will not find a statute granting Jus Primae Noctis. The silence is absolute. Instead, you find satire. In French fabliaux, comic tales recited in noble halls. The greedy lord demands the first night, only to be tricked by clever peasants. The audience laughs at his humiliation. Satire does not prove practice, but it proves familiarity. The joke would not land unless the rumour was already known. Humour preserves what history denies. Travel to Scotland. In later sources, a word appears, collagium. Some claim it was a bedding tax, others a shadow of the first night rite. But by the time it surfaces, the medieval period has passed. In France, the phrase droit de cuissage, literally the right of the thigh, enters print centuries after the time it pretends to describe. Both are antiques polished for sale. They look old, but they are not. People accepted them because they fit an empty space in memory. Petitions also echo with rumour. Towns purchasing freedom from their lords wrote charters declaring unjust customs abolished. Sometimes they listed them: forced labour, arbitrary tolls, unfair arrests. Other times the phrase stood alone, a blank that later storytellers filled with the darkest possibility they knew. A missing list became proof of a hidden horror. Thus, reformers in later centuries insisted. See, they themselves admitted the practice. The silence was interpreted as confession. The church records tell another tale. Priests wrote of bans and blessings, of penances for clandestine marriages, of rituals sprinkling water at the bridal bed. To their communities, these customs sanctified the union. To later eyes, they looked like intrusion. A chronicler centuries later might read of a priest standing at the bridal threshold and imagine a lord stepping across it. The misreading became memory. Pause and watch the villagers around the hearth. An elder tells a child why her mother looked anxious on her wedding night. "Because the Lord might come," she whispers. She does not know whether it ever happened. She only knows the story has always been told. To the child, the tale is more real than the ledger in the steward's desk. Memory passes by voice, not by ink. Modern historians sit under the glow of desk lamps, parchments spread before them. They find entries for marriage fees, for bedding rituals, for fines, for scandals. They find satire mocking arrogant lords. They find reformers denouncing unjust customs. But they do not find a single charter, law, or edict granting the right of the first night. They write carefully. There is no legal proof. There is ample evidence of fear. That sentence is sober, truthful, and far less memorable than the legend it tries to untangle. Fear travels faster than fact. So, what do we learn from the archive? That rumour thrives where law is silent. That payment and ritual, misunderstood, can grow into myth. That satire preserves shadows even when parchment denies them. That power does not need to act to be feared. The archive doors close behind us, dear listener, and stone drinks the echo until only the hush of evening remains. Outside, night returns to the lanes, and the rumour returns to its work among hearths and thresholds. If no statute ever granted a lord the first night, why do villagers behave as if a knock could arrive at any hour? To understand the legend's strength, we must watch ordinary hours teach discipline, how a whisper becomes a rule, how imagination polices a door better than iron. Begin at a cottage near the barley field. The roof is thatch, the walls are wattle and daub, the floor tamped clay strewn with rushes that smell of hay and smoke. Wedding garlands droop above a low door cut to keep winter out. On a trestle table rest bread, a small wheel of cheese, a sprig of rosemary, and a chipped cup of ale saved from the feast. The hearth is red with coals. A candle thins in its iron holder. Each sound is magnified. A hinge taking the night wind, a dog turning in sleep, a cart passing on the road that climbs toward the manor. The bride and groom sit close and try to believe that the room belongs to them. The roomer sits too, uninvited, on the three-legged stool by the door. The groom has known the Lord's reach since boyhood. He swore the mill before he shaped letters. Every sack passes beneath the steward's window. Every bundle of sticks can earn a fine if gathered at the wrong hour. When he fishes the river, he looks over his shoulder as if the water itself were borrowed. His body keeps count without being told. The habit follows him into the chamber. He measures the candle. the distance to the latch, the weight of the knife under the mattress. All because counting feels like control. The bride has known the Lord's reach from another angle. Her labor was tallied through her mother's hands, washing, gleaning, spinning, lifting at harvest. She listened while adults discussed the merchant and fell quiet when she entered the room. She watched her mother take a linen purse from the beam and count the coins 3 times before walking up to the manor. No one said the fee purchased anything but permission. Permission, nevertheless, became a presence that pressed on imagination. Imagination forged a key where none existed. Neighbors linger at the threshold because beginnings are communal. Some sing a verse, some wish blessings in a tone that tastes like caution, and one old aunt insists on straightening the sheet as if order could protect happiness. When they finally step away, their voices do not fall silent, they simply move into the lane. Rumor loves lanes. It happened once in the next valley, someone says. The steward arrived drunk, another replies. The Lord? No, the steward carried his authority like a torch. A third recounts how a family paid more than the fee so that no questions would be asked. Fear purchases insurance where law offers little. Why does the shadow grow? Because it fits the world's logic. In this manner, bridges, ovens, mills, pastures, woodlands, and meadows are counted and controlled. The only place not inventoried by the steward is the inside of the door just closed. The rumor insists that even this room is provisional. It says, keep still. Do not laugh too loudly. Do not trust the latch string. The whisper copies the structure of power and extends it past the limits of visible authority. It writes a curfew on the heart. There is a boy sleeping on a pallet in the corner, the bride's little brother, carried here after the feast and too excited to walk home. He breathes with the quick rhythm of children. In the morning he will not remember the hour, only the pitch of adult voices, the way they tried to speak lightly while their eyes stayed on the door. He will keep that tone in his chest as a tuning fork. Years later, when he marries, he will hum the same note without knowing why. Rumor trains the next generation. Across the lane, the bride's mother sits with hands folded until the knuckles shine. She tells herself to trust the priest's blessing, the neighbor's songs, the latch cut from good wood. She recalls, unwillingly, a story about a cousin in another parish where a steward laughed too freely and the family felt the laughter like a stain. Was the laughter proof of power or only bad manners? The story does not say. Stories are reservoirs for anxiety, and a little water keeps them deep. The groom's father sharpens a small knife because sharpening gives his hands something to do. He does not plan to use it. He wants to believe the house stands outside politics. He wants to believe the law protects in practice as it does on parchment. He knows, however, that parchment lives far away and answers slowly, while a man with a key can move quickly. The knife is not a weapon. It is a prayer shaped in iron. He slips it back into its sheath and sits very still, counting breaths as if counting were a shield. In the castle hall, lamps sway in the draught. The Lord takes stew from a wooden bowl while hounds thump their tails. He speaks of rents and pasture. He does not think of the cottage door at all. But the villagers cannot know what he thinks. Imagination fills the gap. In their minds, the Lord always looks down from a balcony, always holds a key. When he says nothing, silence acquires a voice. When he does not appear, absence takes a shape. Oppression flourishes in the space between what could be done and what will not be denied. There is, too, the theatre of the road. A travelling singer arrives each spring and each autumn, trading verses for supper. He has a song that makes everyone laugh. A foolish baron demands the first night and is tricked by a miller's wife who swaps places in the dark. The laughter is honest, the relief real. Comedy offers a safe place to touch a live wire. No one afterward calls the song evidence. No one forgets the image either. Jests leave silhouettes where testimonies would be challenged. Even the seasons rehearse submission. At Michaelmas, Jews are measured. At Martinmas, pigs are slaughtered. At Candlemas, candles are counted and blessed. Ritual gives structure, and structure teaches the body when to bow and when to speak. The bedding procession belongs to that calendar. It is not seizure, It is a watch kept by neighbors. Still, being led to the chamber by many hands makes the door feel publicly owned. If an entire village can walk you to the threshold, perhaps someone else imagines the right to step through. What of courage? It lives here as well, unspectacular but durable. A sister curls beside the hearth, so she is near if a cry is heard. A friend offers to sleep on the bench outside, claiming he has had too much ale to walk home, but meaning, "I will be here if you need me." Courage often wears clumsy clothes because clumsiness draws less attention. The rumour is loud. Bravery prefers privacy. Listen to the wind climbing the road. Every gust seems to place a foot on the step. Every lull feels like the breath someone takes before knocking. The couple hold hands, then separate, then hold hands again. They speak more to the air than to each other. They list small tasks for the morning because naming ordinary things thins the night. Fetch water, mend a harness, borrow a comb from an aunt. Mundane plans are talismans against grand intrusions. The mind builds fences from chores when wood for real fences is scarce. In time, sleep arrives by persuasion rather than conquest. The candle gutters and the coals resign themselves to ash. No one knocks. Nothing happens. And still the rumour grows, because nothing happening cannot compete with what might have happened. Relief writes no legend. People remember the tower, not the empty road. They remember the held breath, not the ordinary exhale that finally followed. By dawn, the story has already improved itself. At the well, a neighbour says she heard an owl at midnight and decides it was an omen, retrofitted to a past that now seems perilous. At the bake oven, someone reports a creak that must have been a boot. The creak was a hinge, but the hinge can be persuaded. Language proposes, the heart agrees. Memory signs the revision. We might protest that all this is smoke without fire, but smoke stings and changes the way a village breathes. The couple will live with a hesitancy that has no author. The mother will carry a prayer that has no liturgy. The fathers will sharpen tools that have no enemies. Even if no lord knocks, the rumour has entered the room and taken a seat on the stool by the door. It will stay for years unless someone asks it to leave aloud and often. The strange thing is how exportable the shadow proves to be. A peddler returning from a distant market repeats a version with another steward's name. A pilgrim on the road to a shrine shares a version that uses another season, another tax, another song. Details change to suit the ear, but the structure does not. There is always a door. There is always a key. There is always a man who may or may not appear. There is always a village that holds its breath. The pattern is portable because it is built from elements every community recognizes: authority, ceremony, debt, and a night when joy wishes to be private. Before we leave this place, mark one more scene. The priest who blessed the marriage stands in the church doorway, watching smoke lift from cottage chimneys. He taught that the bed is sacrament, and he meant it. He also knows that sacraments are not walls. They are promises. Promises require guardians. He considers preaching directly against the rumour, naming it and forbidding it life. He chooses instead to speak about trust, because trust is the breath a community must practice if it hopes to weaken imagination's claim on the latch. Evening returns as surely as rent day. The couple comes back from the fields dusty and amused by small victories. A straight furrow, a hen that has finally learned a new roost. The world has not ended. A hawk wheels above the meadow. Both glance up in the same instant. They laugh at themselves, and the laughter is tender. And still they glance toward the castle tower. Habit teaches the neck which way to turn. The legend is lodged not in a law book, but in posture, in the tilt of a head when a road runs toward a gatehouse. That is why statutes cannot kill it, and charters cannot prove it. The legend's palace is the nervous system. To dislodge it needs not a document, but a different narrative told often, one that reframes fees, rituals, songs, and the quiet fact of a door closing. Follow the thread as it leaves this village. The same whisper rehearses itself elsewhere, taking on the voice of glens and lowlands, of chalk hills and cities with bell towers that count hours like coins. It is the same shape carried by new wind. We will listen to it speak in other tongues and wear other names, and we will measure how far a shadow can travel when a world believes a key exists. The path already tilts toward other borders, and the next threshold waits with its latch lifted a finger's width, neither open nor closed, inviting the rumour to prove how far it can roam. The whisper has left the village, dear listener. It slides down lanes, crosses meadows, and follows traders on winding roads. What began as a murmur at one cottage door now learns to speak in new tongues. The legend of the first night is not a prisoner of any parish. It travels, it adapts, it survives. Tonight, we follow it across frontiers, listening to the shapes it takes in other lands. Imagine a pilgrim on the road to Santiago, staff in hand, cloak patched, boots worn thin. At an inn, he repeats what he heard in the last valley. In my country, the Lord claims the bride before the groom. The listeners lean closer. None can prove it, but the tale fits their sense of injustice. The rumour is retold with flourishes. Sometimes the Lord himself, sometimes his steward, sometimes a priest who abuses trust. By dawn, the tale has taken root in a new region. A seed carried in breath has planted itself in another imagination. In Scotland, the word collegium begins to appear in records centuries after the Middle Ages. Scholars argue over its meaning. Some say it was simply a bedding tax, money due when a couple married. Others insist it carried a darker shade, an echo of the rite of the first night. By the time it surfaces, the rumour is already polished by time, presented as a relic. Villagers believe because it fits what they know of power: lords with high towers, families pressed for dues, marriages shadowed by fees. The legend bends to their dialect, wears their plaid, and continues. Cross the Channel to France. There, the phrase droit de cuissage takes hold. Literally the right of the thigh. It sounds both delicate and cruel. French chroniclers of later centuries wield it as proof of feudal arrogance. Satirists sharpen it into jokes. Revolutionaries brandish it as evidence of tyranny. Though no medieval charter records it, the term flourishes in pamphlets, in novels, in fiery speeches. The whisper has become French, elegant, and biting. Travel further into Italy, where city-states rise like fortresses of stone and marble. There, the rumour drapes itself in local colour. Chronicles accuse rival families of practicing obscene customs. To smear an enemy is easier if the enemy can be painted as corrupt, not only in law, but in bed. The rite of the first night becomes less a fear of lords in distant castles, and more a weapon of politics hurled across city walls. Each retelling reinforces the sense that somewhere, someone must have lived this humiliation. What is striking is not the detail, but the persistence. The story never keeps the same clothing. Sometimes it is a tax, sometimes a ritual, sometimes a command whispered at the church door. But the skeleton never changes. The couple, the threshold, the looming figure of authority. The shadow steps into every land because every land knows shadows of its own. Picture a map of Europe spread on a wooden table. Tiny figures walk along inked roads, carrying more than sacks. They carry words. A merchant in Flanders hears the tale and repeats it in Bruges. A monk in Burgundy copies a note about unjust customs and hears students debate what that phrase must mean. A soldier in the Pyrenees recalls the story told by a shepherd and repeats it at a campfire. Each border crossed adds a new accent, but not a new ending. Listen to how each community reshapes the tale. In France, it is aristocratic arrogance. In Scotland, it is a tax with teeth. In Italy, it is slander between rivals. The legend is a mirror, reflecting whatever fear or anger a region already knows. Where peasants feel overtaxed, the tale becomes a fee. Where nobles are mocked, it becomes a jest. Where revolution brews, it becomes an accusation too sharp to ignore. And always, at the heart, is humiliation. The rumour thrives because it dramatizes dependence. To imagine a lord between bride and groom is to confess how little of life is private under feudal watch. That image is portable. It requires no parchment, no seal, no soldier. It needs only imagination and resentment, and those are plentiful in every land. Now pause with me in a French tavern on the eve of revolution. A pamphleteer reads aloud by candlelight. He describes peasants robbed not only of harvest, but of dignity, forced to surrender brides to arrogant lords. The audience gasps, murmurs, nods. No one asks for charters or proof. The story feels true because injustice already fills their lives. Legend becomes weapon. Rumor becomes rallying cry. This is how myths cross borders, not by accuracy, but by resonance. They travel with the discontented, carried like embers in cloth, ready to ignite where anger waits. Each land adds its own fuel. Each tongue retells until it forgets the silence in the archive. Memory becomes louder than evidence, so the whisper has become a chorus. It no longer belongs to one valley but to many. It echoes from Scotland's mist, from France's courts, from Italy's piazzas. What began as fear in a cottage has become an accusation hurled at thrones. But the tale is not finished. Soon, artists will seize it. Minstrels and playwrights will lace it into songs and stages, wrapping fear in laughter and rhyme. The rumor will not only accuse, it will also entertain. The whisper has crossed borders, dear listener. In Scotland, it wore the shape of a tax. In France, it sharpened into a phrase. In Italy, it became slander hurled between rivals. But in another realm, it found new life. On stages, in verses, in songs sung at tavern tables. For rumor does not always hide in fear. Sometimes it dresses in laughter. Satire kept the legend alive when parchment remained silent. Picture a crowded hall in northern France, its rafters black with smoke. A jester jingles bells on his cap as he bows to the noble audience. With exaggerated strut, he mimics a greedy lord demanding the first night. The crowd bursts into laughter as the lord is tricked by a clever peasant girl who switches places with her grandmother. The punchline is bawdy, the humiliation complete. Nobles laugh until tears shine in their eyes. Yet beneath their amusement lingers something else, the recognition that such arrogance is believable. Comedy makes cruelty easier to admit. In rural taverns, minstrels carried similar tales. With lute or fiddle, they sang of barons humiliated, of stewards duped, of brides who outwitted men twice their age. These were not official histories, but oral theatre. Villagers leaned forward, laughing loud, repeating verses by memory until every ear knew them. The songs made peasants feel momentarily victorious. If they could not defeat authority in life, they could at least in story. The satire did more than amuse. It preserved the image. Each performance rehearsed the shape of the rumor. A bride, a groom, a lord demanding, a community resisting. Even when sung as parody, the legend was confirmed. Listeners did not forget the laughter. They did not forget the shadow behind it either. Fear coated in jest still lingers when the tune fades. Consider the fabliaux, short comic tales in verse, popular in France from the 12th to 14th centuries. Many depict foolish or corrupt nobles. The rite of the first night appears as a familiar trope, instantly understood by audiences. These were not reports of actual events. They were mirrors polished to show arrogance clearly. When recited in marketplaces or at noble banquets, fabliaux mocked lords while entertaining them. That paradox is telling. Even nobles found humor in the caricature of their own power. Perhaps they laughed to deny the fear. Perhaps they laughed because denial itself felt like control. Travel to a village green during midsummer. A play is staged with crude costumes, wooden swords, painted masks, garlands for crowns. Children laugh as a lord chases a bride around the stage, only to be doused with water by villagers. The message is playful, arrogance punished, community triumphant. But the image remains, the lord imagined at the threshold of the wedding bed. The joke is remembered long after the laughter fades. Song and satire also spread the legend further than parchment could. A merchant might forget a statute, but he remembers a catchy refrain. A peasant might never read a charter, but she repeats a story heard from a jester. Oral culture was the bloodstream of medieval life. The rumour coursed through it, clothed in rhyme and jest, impossible to silence because it was entertaining. And what of the emotions satire stirred? For the powerless, it offered relief. To laugh at the Lord was to reclaim a sliver of dignity. For the powerful, it offered distance. By laughing, they pretended the accusation was absurd, a fiction too comical to be feared. In truth, both reactions kept the legend alive. Humour was not an antidote, it was a preservative. Even manuscripts preserved this mockery. Marginal illustrations in illuminated texts show figures engaged in antics half sacred, half profane. A monk doodles a scene where a lord is tricked at a door. These drawings were never meant as chronicles, but they reveal how deeply the tale lived in imagination. The line between satire and memory blurred. So the whisper wore bells on its hat and carried a lute. It crossed valleys in rhymes. It tumbled from the mouths of jesters. It echoed in the laughter of crowds. It was safer to joke than to accuse, easier to mock than to rebel. And through that safety, the story endured. But soon, the stage would not be enough. Beyond jesters and minstrels, another voice would seize the legend, the church. Priests searching for examples of sin and arrogance found it ready at hand. What satire mocked, sermons thundered. The whisper would leave taverns and plays to ascend pulpits, where it gained the authority of scripture and the sting of eternal warning. The laughter fades, dear listener. The tavern grows quiet, the jester bows, and the fiddler lowers his bowstring. But where the noise of comedy ends, another kind of voice begins. Solemn, heavy, echoing beneath stone arches. The church, guardian of souls, also sees the tale of the first night. To priests and preachers, the legend was not a joke, but a moral weapon. If satire mocked the arrogance of lords, sermons condemned it as sin. Step with me into a medieval church. The nave is cold, the walls painted with saints and demons, the air heavy with incense. Villagers kneel on rushes, heads bowed. The priest climbs the pulpit, lifts his hand, and begins to speak. His Latin is laced with vernacular so all can understand. He warns against pride, against lords who forget their place beneath God. And then he tells a story. He describes a noble so arrogant that he claimed the first night of every bride. His sin was not only lust, but sacrilege, trespassing upon a sacrament blessed by God. The villagers shift uncomfortably. Some glance toward the castle hill. The story may not be law, but it feels true enough to pierce their hearts. The priest does not need parchment proof. He needs only the weight of belief. In sermons across Europe, the legend appeared as an example of unchecked power. Preachers thundered, "If lords can claim even the bridal bed, then no threshold is safe without God's protection." The tale became a parable of sin, proof that pride leads to damnation. It was used to frighten, to warn, to remind both rich and poor of the limits set by heaven. But sermons did more than warn. They shaped memory. A child hearing the story from a pulpit would carry it home as truth. A peasant repeating it at a hearth would add details drawn from fear. A generation later, no one would remember whether the tale was satire or sermon. They only remembered that it had always been told. The church also recorded rituals that blurred the line. Priests blessed the marriage bed with holy water, recited prayers over sheets, stood at thresholds with candles. These actions were meant to sanctify, but in retelling they could be mistaken for intrusion. Centuries later, reformers read these records and imagined a lord in the priest's place. The church's effort to guard became, in memory, proof of violation. Why did priests choose this story? Because it dramatized power's corruption in a way every peasant understood. It was one thing to speak of lords raising unjust taxes. That was abstract. It was another to speak of lords invading a wedding bed. That was vivid, unforgettable enough to become myth, and so the legend deepened. No longer confined to rumor or comedy, it now carried the gravity of religion. Sin gave it authority. Every retelling in church made the rumor harder to dismiss. If God's own ministers repeated it, who would dare call it false? But there is a paradox. By condemning the legend, the church preserved it. Every sermon that used it as warning carried it further. Every priest who thundered against arrogance made the story sound more real. The whisper had now learned to echo beneath vaulted ceilings. Soon, however, another echo would rise, not from pulpits, but from streets. Rebels and revolutionaries would seize the same tale, sharpening it into a weapon against power itself. What sermons used for moral lessons, uprisings would use for banners. The story was about to march into politics. The priest's voice has thundered through the nave, dear listener. The incense still clings to the air. The echo of his sermon clings to the villagers' ears. But once they leave the church and step into the square, the story does not remain a parable. It becomes a spark. Fear and outrage ferment into anger, and anger, when gathered in numbers, becomes rebellion. Picture the 14th century in England. Fields are heavy with harvest, yet peasants mutter that their burdens grow heavier still. Taxes demanded for wars abroad, dues pressed upon families, fees collected for marriages and millstones. Into this atmosphere of resentment comes the old rumor that the Lord claims not only their coin but their dignity, that he stands between bride and groom on the most sacred night. The tale spreads like fire in dry straw. It may never be proven, but it feels true. And truth in rebellion is measured in passion, not parchment. In 1381, the peasants' revolt erupted. Chroniclers record cries against taxes, against corruption, against oppressive lords. While the right of the first night is not explicitly listed, the spirit of the legend, lords violating every threshold, haunted their fury. Imagine the shouts of villagers in the square, pitchforks in hand. They take our grain, our daughters, our very beds. The rumor was not an item in their petitions. It was the shadow behind them, justifying rage, sharpening the sense that nothing was safe from exploitation. Cross to France, centuries later. The Cahiers de doléances, the grievances written in 1789 before the French Revolution, seethe with accusations against noble privilege. Pamphlets printed in cheap ink declare that lords demanded not only taxes but brides. Revolutionary writers wielded droit de cuissage as proof that aristocracy was monstrous, that feudalism was built on humiliation. Even if historians could find no medieval charter, the image of a noble at the bridal bed was too powerful to resist. It became symbol, weapon, justification. In Scotland and Italy too, rebels drew on the same image. When towns bought freedom from their lords, they spoke of abolishing unjust customs. No one needed to name them. The imagination supplied the darkest possibility. During riots, whispers in the crowd insisted that liberation meant no more shadows at the wedding door. Why did revolutionaries seize this legend? Because it painted oppression in terms everyone understood. A tax may seem abstract, but a bride stolen from her husband's side is immediate, visceral, unforgettable. In an age when most peasants could not read, the story carried meaning more potent than any charter. It told them, your suffering is not only economic, but intimate. Pamphleteers knew this. They sharpened their pens into daggers, sketching images of fanged nobles leaning over trembling brides. The drawings were crude, but clarity was their power. Distributed through markets, pasted on tavern walls, smuggled across borders, they inflamed indignation. People repeated them with the same certainty they repeated rumors by the hearth. Rebellion, however, also reshaped the legend. In the mouths of revolutionaries, the story became proof of why an old world must be torn down. Whether or not it had ever happened was irrelevant. What mattered was that it represented the arrogance of power. The myth was not accessory. It was evidence, tried and sentenced in the court of public rage. And so, from village rumor to tavern laughter, from church sermon to revolutionary pamphlet, the tale grew sharper. It was not only a story of fear, but a story of accusation. Where satire had mocked, and sermons had warned, rebellion used it to justify bloodshed. But when the flames cooled, another question emerged. Historians, quills in hand, began to ask, was it ever real? Did lords truly exercise such a right, or had generations of fear and fury built a spectre taller than fact? In the quiet after revolution, scholarship began to gather the ashes of rumour. That will be our next path, to watch scholars by candlelight, debating whether the right existed at all, or whether it lived only in imagination sharpened by grievance. The roar of rebellion has dimmed, dear listener. The pamphlets are ashes, the crowds have scattered, and the slogans that once shook cities are now faint memories carried on old banners. But the legend of the Lord's first night did not vanish with revolution. When the noise of streets fell silent, another sound replaced it, the steady scratch of quills in lamplight. Scholars bent over parchment, manuscripts, and charters, searching for truth inside centuries of rumour. It is here, in the quiet glow of the scholar's candle, that we watch the tale meet its sternest judges. Picture a 17th century library in Paris. Shelves climb to the ceiling, filled with manuscripts bound in leather, edges dark with dust. A scholar in a fur-lined robe sits at a long table. His quill hovers, hesitates, dips into ink. He has read the pamphlets that cried out against droit de cuissage during the Revolution. He has heard the story repeated in taverns and sermons. But he asks, where is the parchment, the statute, the decree? He turns folios one after another, and in each he finds taxes, tolls, rents, but never a law granting the first night. His frustration grows, for he must explain why the legend is everywhere in memory, yet nowhere in record. Across Europe, others face the same dilemma. In Scotland, antiquarians examine mentions of collegium, wondering whether it was truly a bedding tax or simply a mistranslation. In Germany, legal historians compare manorial codes, searching for precedent. In Italy, archivists pore over city statutes, hunting for a clause that might explain the rumour. Their findings echo one another, silence in the sources. The scholar's candles burn late into the night, but the silence remains. And so debate begins. One camp declares it never existed. It was satire, rumour, and revolutionary propaganda, nothing more. Another camp counters, but how could a myth endure for so long, in so many places, unless it had roots? Perhaps it was never law, but abuse given the weight of custom. Between them, arguments sharpen. For every absence of evidence, there is evidence of fear. For every denial, there is a testimony, oral and emotional, impossible to erase. The scholar's dilemma is deeper than documents. How does one measure memory? A parchment speaks clearly, but what of a grandmother's tale at the hearth, or a song sung by jesters, or a sermon thundered from pulpits? Scholars wrestle not only with history, but with the line between story and fact. The legend has escaped the reach of quills. It belongs to imagination as much as to evidence. Some scholars choose to trace the myth's genealogy rather than its truth. They follow the rumour across borders, identifying when the phrase droit de cuissage first appears in French print, when antiquarians in Scotland first debate collegium, when Italian pamphleteers accuse rivals with tales of violation. They note that the story often flowers during moments of political upheaval, when communities need a vivid symbol of tyranny. In this light, the legend becomes less about feudal bedrooms and more about collective rage given a body. Others approach the myth as allegory. To them, it represents the deepest fear of serfs, that no part of life, not even the most intimate, is safe from authority. Even if no lord ever claimed such a right, the possibility captured the essence of feudal dependence. In this view, the story is historically false, yet emotionally true. It reveals the psychology of subjection better than any tax roll could. The candle burns lower. A scholar writes, "The absence of record is decisive." Another responds, "But the persistence of the legend is equally decisive. Their words fill volumes, but the dispute never closes. Instead, It shifts the legend's home from lore to scholarship. The myth has now become a case study, an exhibit in debates about how memory and power entwine. Step into the 19th century. Universities swell. Printing presses multiply. Academic journals emerge. In these pages, the debate over Jus Primae Noctis becomes an academic sport. Some professors dismiss it with scorn, calling it a fable for peasants and pamphleteers. Others cautiously insist it may have been practiced unofficially, even if no statute records it. Each citation builds on the last, like a tower made of echo. The story is no longer whispered at thresholds, but footnoted in treatises. And yet, for every dry paragraph, there remains a spark of fascination. Students copy passages, novelists take notes, dramatists listen at the edge of lecture halls. The scholar's candle lights not only charters, but imaginations. The legend cannot be sealed in an archive. It slips out again, ready to dress itself in ink and illustration. For those scholars debate, artists create. Soon the myth will appear not only in manuscripts, but in illuminated margins, in satirical sketches, in woodcut prints. Ink will carry the whisper into new forms of memory, making the image harder to forget. What the scholar questions, the artist preserves. That is the road awaiting us next. The scholar's candle throws a small circle of light. Dear listener, but beyond that circle, images wait, patient as winter. When words argue, pictures often decide. The legend of the first night did not live in statutes, and scholars quarreled over the silence. Nonetheless, pens drew and brushes glowed. Art made the whisper visible. In margins and miniatures, on boards and walls, the tale found a face and a doorway, a bed half in light and half under the long reach of a tower's shadow. Enter a scriptorium where monks copy books for princes and cathedrals. The room hums with quiet labour, knives scraping vellum smooth, quills trimmed with practiced snaps, pigments ground in shells. Along the page's border, where vines curl and beasts chase their tails, an illuminator adds a small theatre of his own. A tiny lord with a ridiculous crown reaches for a bride. A tiny maid with a calm face holds the latch. The scene interrupts no sentence and confirms no law, but it tells the reader where the heart of fear resides. At the threshold, where a private promise seeks to close its door and a public shadow refuses to shrink. Move forward to workshops where woodcutters press knives into planks. Their images are coarse compared to gilded miniatures, but power thrives in coarseness. A single block can print 100 sheets. 100 sheets can travel farther than any monk's volume. In these cuts, a castle window casts a ragged triangle of black across a bed. A steward stands with a scroll labelled "Custom," while a couple shrink into the corner. Buyers pin the print on tavern beams, glue it to market stalls, fold it into letters sent to cousins 3 valleys away. Soon, strangers know the picture as if it were a neighbour's face. Painters catch the rumour as well. In a village church, a muralist filling a wall with saints slips in a small domestic scene in the lower register. A door half open, a key in a hand, a second hand held up in refusal. Parishioners kneel beneath it each week, hardly noticing until a sermon lifts their eyes to the picture and names the sin it suggests. In a city palace, a court painter borrows the motif for a morality allegory, rendering the Lord with a face that looks suspiciously like a rival patron. The message travels on varnish and rumour at the same speed. Not all images condemn, some mock. In manuscript margins, a rabbit dressed as a knight chases a frowning noble away from a door. In carnival prints, a masked bride presents the steward with a ladle instead of a key, while the crowd howls. These jokes tame the horror by making it ridiculous. The outline remains, though, even when the line curls into satire. A door, a key, a figure at the threshold. The pictorial grammar settles into the eye until the mind supplies the rest without asking. Consider how pictures train memory. A child who cannot read stands in a church, counting the jewels in a painted border, and discovers the small scene tucked in a corner. A bride's veil, a hand on a latch, a shadow from a tower. She will not learn the Latin for decades, but she already knows the shape of the rumour. Another child in a market points to the woodcut glued above a stall and asks his mother why the lord in the picture looks angry. The mother says only that some customs are wicked. The boy nods and grows up remembering the drawing better than any homily. Artists borrow from each other. A motif begun in a monastery runs along trade routes with merchants and reappears in the notebook of a city painter, simplified and sharpened. A German printmaker turns a French joke into a universal emblem. An Italian engraver translates a Scottish anecdote into a grim tableau with Roman columns. The legend's vocabulary gains synonyms in line and colour. The latch becomes a ring of iron. The steward's scroll becomes a seal on a ribbon. The tower's shadow becomes a path laid across sheets. Repetition creates authority for eyes, the way footnotes do for minds. Images also shape blame. When pamphleteers want to injure a rival, they use the emblem with surgical focus. A noble enemy is rendered with a particular scar at the threshold of a door that everyone recognizes as the newly married baker's house. No caption states the charge, and the charge bites all the same. Paintings travel in gossip the way letters do in couriers' bags. A single sketch on a tavern wall can ruin a reputation faster than any lawsuit can repair it. There is a quieter school of image too, the still life with symbols. On a board table sit a loaf, a blade, a sprig of rue, an iron key, a ribbon torn in two. The composition whispers without depicting a body at all. A viewer who knows the rumour feels a shiver and cannot say why. Master painters use such restraint to slip past censors while still summoning the old fear. In every region the set of objects differs, but the syntax remains. Domestic things arranged as an omen. Meanwhile, the book trade multiplies images like spring water. Printers include small cuts when they reprint old tales, and the cuts fossilize the legend for new generations. A later historian paging through a volume sees the picture and squints, uncertain whether it records fact or only tastes. Pictures are poor witnesses and perfect persuaders. They do not swear oaths, they simply wait to be believed. Listen to the dialogue between pens and brushes. Scholars say, "Show me the statute." Artists reply, "Here is the feeling." Scholars warn, "Silence in the record is decisive." Artists answer, "Silence needs a face." The quarrel is not a war so much as a duet, and the legend survives because both voices are useful. In classrooms and studios, in chancelleries and kitchens, the same three shapes, door, key, shadow, compose themselves again and again until viewers accept them as part of history's furniture. Follow one image across decades. In its first form, it is a playful marginal joke. In the next, a woodcut stamped in rough ink. Later, it becomes a moralizing canvas with a Latin motto. Then, an opera backdrop. Then, a lithograph sold to tourists as a souvenir of picturesque cruelty. The object changes, the message does not. Power leaning across a threshold it does not own. By the time cinema arrives, the storyboards are already written by centuries of painters. People ask whether images created the legend or only reflected it. The answer hides in the way pictures work. They do not fabricate ex nihilo. They rearrange recognition. When viewers nod before a door and a key and a shadow, they are acknowledging that those elements belong to the world they know. The picture merely gives permission to keep nodding. In that sense, the image is less an invention than a vote of confidence in a rumour already elected by fear. There is danger in this confidence. A community that sees the emblem everywhere will soon see it where it does not belong. An ordinary bedding procession becomes, in memory, an intrusion. A steward carrying a wedding register becomes, in a sketch, a leering collector of bodies. The emblem bleeds. It stains the next page, the next wall, the next season, and the stain is difficult to wash because it never claims to be blood, only shadow. Even so, images sometimes rescue. Artists who love justice use the same grammar to argue for dignity. A door stands open and the shadow stops at the sill. The bride and groom hold the key together. Above them, a tower leans, but its angle misleads. The ground beneath it has shifted, and the shadow falls short. In such pictures, The legend is acknowledged only to be contradicted. Viewers leave with a different memory. The threshold belonged to the couple after all. Stand with me in a small museum where a curator adjusts light on a case that holds an illuminated page. The margin shows a tiny bride refusing a crowned figure. The letter beside it speaks of harvest yields. Nothing in the text mentions bedrooms or rites. The contradiction is familiar now. Words ignore what pictures insist upon. The curator jots a label. Allegorical marginal scene, themes of authority and domestic space. A group of visitors nods. Some will go home and search for statutes. Others will keep the image and never look for paper again. If pictures gave the legend a body, the human voice sustains its breath. In the rooms beyond this gallery, there are kitchens warm with steam, courtyards smoky with firewood, lanes where neighbors trade secrets while bread cools on windowsills. That is where the emblem turns into sentences again. Quiet refusals, careful advice, fragments of courage passed from hand to hand. We will step there next, to hear how ordinary people keep their own record without ink, how resistance speaks softly and still leaves marks on the door. The gallery of images closes behind us, dear listener, and we step outside into colder air. Paintings fade, manuscripts return to shelves, and prints curl on tavern walls, but the rumour refuses to sleep. It now belongs to voices, small, persistent, sometimes trembling, sometimes laughing. These voices do not wait for parchment or pigment. They live in the rhythm of kitchens, in the bustle of courtyards, in the songs of markets, and in the silences of night watches. Through them, the legend of the first night finds a new endurance, not in lore, but in life. Imagine a kitchen at dusk. The rafters are blackened by years of smoke, the bench polished by generations of elbows. A grandmother stirs a pot and tells a tale between spoonfuls. Her story is not written, yet it carries all the weight of memory. She describes a cunning bride who deceived the steward with a decoy bed, and the children around her laugh with relief. They do not ask whether the tale is true. They absorb its lesson. Danger can be tricked, dignity defended. In such kitchens, resistance is whispered with broth and bread. Cross the courtyard where laundry flutters like banners. Women beat linen against boards, their voices rising with steam. One remembers how neighbours lingered in a lane until the chamber candle was snuffed. Another shares a sprig of rue tied with red thread to guard a doorway. A third repeats the midwife's advice. Place shoes inward at the threshold, so mischief will lose its path. Their chatter is work and warning at once. These fragments knit into a code of survival stronger than any statute. The courtyard becomes a parliament where law is unwritten but binding. In the fields, men sharpen scythes and trade jokes. The steward may tally hens, but he cannot tally hearts, one declares, and laughter breaks the tension of harvest dues. Such humour does not deny fear, it reshapes it. The act of turning dread into jest transforms vulnerability into courage rehearsed. Every quip is a rehearsal for resistance, a promise disguised as laughter. Shared wit is lighter than armour, but can stiffen spines just as firmly. Markets turn rumour into performance. A storyteller mounts a crate, retelling a version where geese under a quilt foil a greedy intruder. The crowd roars, coins clatter, children remember feathers flying in confusion. Everyone knows the geese stand for what cannot be named. The applause plants seeds of defiance. If a tale can make a tyrant ridiculous, then perhaps power itself can be mocked. Each cheer is a vote of confidence in resistance. Markets become theatres where imagination stages victory. Resistance speaks in silence too. A bride's sister pretends to mend by the door, letting her needle tap the latch. A groom feigns sleep but keeps his hand on the string that dangles through the wood. Friends linger longer than custom, claiming one more song or one more cup. But in truth, keeping watch. These acts leave no record, but they echo in memory. Silence is not emptiness. It is protection disguised as ordinary habit. Even scraps of writing join the chorus. A cousin moving to another village scribbles instructions. Keep rosemary near, keep coins ready, keep neighbours close. The words are folded into a prayer book, and a generation later, a grandson finds them and believes them to be law. What began as advice becomes rule by the force of repetition. Memory does not need courts to create obligations. It needs only continuity. Elders contribute with proverbs. Locks remember hands that carved them, or keys speak of houses that guard themselves. Such sayings compress generations of caution into portable wisdom. They survive winters better than letters and outlast the voices that coined them. proverbs travel like seeds, sprouting wherever listeners need reassurance. Each one is a capsule of defiance disguised as common sense. Consider the midwife, a figure of quiet authority. She knows herbs for pulse and breath, and she knows where to place her stool, at thresholds where her presence alone deters intrusion. People say she can read omens in smoke, but her true art lies in recognizing fear on faces and answering it with ritual. A stool by the door, a chant for health, a demand for witnesses, these are her weapons. The midwife turns care into resistance. Pilgrims and travelers spread variants. In one valley, neighbors hang bells on latch strings, ringing at the slightest touch. In another, chalk marks on doors tell friends when to watch closely. Far away, a ferryman tells of a saint's footprint pressed into a threshold stone, promising protection. Each variation is less about accuracy than about persistence. The legend mutates, but the lesson remains. Vigilance belongs to everyone. Defiance takes shape in song as well. Lullabies hide verses about doors that remember who built them, about wood faithful to those who carved it. Children drift to sleep hearing that even timber guards them. These songs slip beneath consciousness, turning fear into familiarity. By adulthood, the habit of trust becomes stubbornness. No one yields a threshold easily when raised on such melodies. Defeats occur. Families pay unjust fees, or brides lie awake in dread, or jokes wound more than they heal. None of this proves the legend real, but it proves vulnerability breeds ritual. People invent patterns so despair will not take root. Accuracy is secondary. Survival requires stories. The rumor thrives because it is useful, and usefulness is its own truth. Sometimes resistance matures into testimony. A widow tells a council how neighbors kept the lane lit until dawn when her daughter wed. She does not boast, she records. A clerk notes it down as if it were policy. Decades later, someone misreads the note as law. Thus, custom hardens into command. The legend, even if false in practice, becomes real in memory through testimony and transcription. Migrations carry rumor and remedy alike. In one town, people parade with lanterns 3 nights after weddings, long after they have forgotten why. In another, families tie latch strings in knots for 7 nights, convinced it brings 7 years of luck. The origin fades, but the practice endures. Fear dissolves into superstition, superstition into festival, and festival into heritage. Resistance camouflages itself as tradition, ensuring continuity. What emerges from these voices is not a single declaration, but a climate. The legend is never alone. It always arrives with countermeasures. Songs, jokes, herbs, lanterns, blankets, and watchful eyes build an atmosphere where intrusion is expected but never uncontested. The community becomes the true threshold, stronger than wood or iron. Children grow inside this climate, learning resistance before they know the word for it. Dignity becomes a habit, rehearsed daily, and here lies the bridge. Pamphleteers, reformers, and dramatists listen at the edges of these kitchens and markets. They gather these murmurs, these proverbs, these tricks of survival, and fashion them into slogans and speeches. What began as lullaby or proverb becomes quotation in assemblies. Soon, the legend walks not only through cottages and lanes, but onto printed pages and illuminated stages. The quiet defiance of villagers will soon echo in theatres and novels. The threshold is about to open into a modern age where rumour becomes performance and whispers turn into literature. The voices of kitchens and courtyards linger like an echo, dear listener. But now the rumour crosses a threshold into grander rooms. Lantern light gives way to chandeliers, rough benches to velvet seats, whispered proverbs to declaimed lines. The tale of the Lord's first night does not vanish with time. It reinvents itself as spectacle. In the age of print and performance, writers, dramatists, and novelists seize the legend as both warning and weapon. Imagine a theatre in 18th century Paris. The audience murmurs as the curtain rises. On stage, a rustic scene. A cottage, a wedding garland, a trembling couple. Then a steward appears, bearing a scroll with seal, declaring the ancient rite. Gasps ripple through the hall. Everyone knows no such law exists in code, yet everyone feels the shiver of recognition. The drama crystallizes fear into image, outrage into plot. When the bride outwits the intruder, the crowd erupts, not only at the triumph of characters, but at the symbolic victory of common folk over tyranny. The legend has become entertainment, and through entertainment, education. Novelists soon adopt it. In serialized stories sold cheaply to clerks and apprentices, a threatened bride embodies all the injustices of feudal remnants. Sometimes she flees, sometimes she is saved by daring lovers, sometimes a disguise turns the tables. Each version rearranges details but keeps the essential conflict: private dignity against public arrogance. Readers turn pages hungrily, not only for romance, but for affirmation that dignity can resist power. By the close of the 19th century, entire genres, melodrama, gothic fiction, even operatic librettos, carry scenes where the first night becomes stage shorthand for oppression. The motif spreads further. Italian opera turns it into a tragic aria, a soprano's voice soaring with both fear and defiance, the orchestra thundering behind. In German drama, it becomes satire, lords portrayed as buffoons undone by witless pride. In Scottish novels, it hides within pastoral plots, emerging suddenly as whispered memory, reminding readers that beneath the heather and songbirds lies unease. Across Europe, the legend mutates with each stage, each page, but always signals the same truth. Unchecked power threatens what should be most private. Notice how literature magnifies what whispers once guarded. A grandmother's tale at the hearth becomes a serialized cliffhanger in print. A market jester's trick with geese becomes a comic interlude in opera. The scale shifts, but the core remains. The threshold, the door, the intrusion. Audiences recognize the structure instantly. They need no footnote. Memory supplies the rest. In this way, art confirms what rumor seeded. Tyranny personified in the act of crossing a door uninvited. Some writers wield the legend politically. Revolutionary pamphlets insert scenes into plays, casting aristocrats as predators and peasants as guardians of virtue. In times of reform, speeches borrow imagery from stage dialogues, invoking brides and thresholds as symbols of violated justice. Even when listeners know the story is fable, the power of image overwhelms doubt. Fiction becomes ammunition, theatre becomes tribunal, novels become manifestos in disguise, and there is irony too. By the late 19th century, scholars had already begun dismantling the legend, arguing no document proved it true. Yet the more scholars doubted, the more artists embraced. On the stage, fact mattered less than resonance. Theatrical audiences cared not whether charters mentioned droit de cuissage. They cared that the idea dramatized fear they understood. Art, unconcerned with verification, preserved the myth more vividly than any archive could. Think of the contrast. In dusty libraries, scholars cross out footnotes, debating absence. In gilded theatres, actors embody presence, stamping boots on wooden boards, shaking fists, crying lines that draw tears. One room insists the legend is baseless, another makes it unforgettable. Between them, audiences choose memory over accuracy. They leave theatres humming choruses, not citing statutes. The modern stage also spreads the legend beyond Europe. Touring troupes carry plays overseas. Novels are translated. Operas performed in distant capitals. In each new land, the story adapts, sometimes framed as feudal cruelty, sometimes as allegory for local injustice. Wherever it travels, it thrives, because its grammar is universal. Door, key, shadow, dignity threatened. Readers and spectators need not know medieval lore. They recognize intrusion. Thus the legend becomes global, a traveling metaphor clothed in local costume. And so, dear listener, what began as whispers in cottages has become thunder in auditoriums. The legend wears costumes, sings arias, hides in chapters, explodes in pamphlets. It survives precisely because art loves symbols more than proofs. On modern stages, it is not a question of fact, but of feeling. Not whether it occurred, but whether it speaks to the terror of unchecked power. That terror needs no parchment to be believed. From here the path turns once again. The stage applauds, the novel thrills, the opera soars. But beyond the curtains, scholars return with sharper tools, determined to test myth against record. The 20th century will bring new verdicts, more skeptical and more rigorous, attempting to settle once and for all whether the first night was ever anything but imagination. Shall we step with them into the historian's study, where footnotes weigh as heavily as arias, and see how memory fares against evidence? The curtain falls, applause fades, novels close, and the orchestra's echo dwindles into silence, dear listener. The world of theatre and opera, of serialized novels and pamphlets, has done its part in shaping imagination. But another world stands ready, colder and sterner. The archive. Here applause is replaced by silence, music by the shuffle of parchment, bright costumes by the dull glow of lamp over oak desks. The legend of the Lord's first night, so alive on stage, must now face the discipline of history. Enter a reading room at dawn. The door unlocks with a heavy key. Dust motes dance in the pale light through tall windows. Scholars sit, each with boxes of brittle rolls tied with faded cords. They untie carefully, unfold parchment, adjust magnifying glasses. In cramped Latin, they read manorial customs, tax rolls, inheritance disputes. Chickens are counted, coins recorded, daughters' marriages priced with merchant fees. A widow may keep her cottage if the roof is sound. A tenant must repair hedges each spring. Every obligation appears, but nowhere a single line about a lord's right to a bride. Silence fills the page more loudly than ink. This silence repeats across regions. In French coutumes, in Scottish statutes, in Italian civic codes, the pattern holds. Payments are exact, duties precise, beds untouched by legal record. Could such a practice escape the pen of clerks who noted every penny and every plank? The answer seems plain. Yet historians are careful. They remind one another that absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence. Abuse can occur unwritten, whispered rather than recorded. Still, across centuries and languages, the void becomes convincing. Debates spark. Some historians declare the legend a satire mistaken for truth, a jest hardened into rumor. Others propose a kernel of practice, perhaps bedding taxes, perhaps humiliating gestures, that memory transformed into darker shapes. A few insist isolated abuses may have occurred without record. Journals fill with articles, footnotes multiplying like vines. Conferences resound with arguments. Myth or custom, satire or abuse, propaganda or memory. Each position sharpens the others. The legend becomes a mirror not of law, but of scholarly method. Consider the Scottish term collegium. Antiquarians once claimed it proved the first night. Later scholars showed it was a bedding tax, a fee for marriage, not an intrusion. But suspicion lingered. Was the payment itself humiliation disguised? Did peasants believe the coin bought off a worse fate? Language fueled the legend more than fact. A gloss, a mistranslation, a flourish of Latin, each bent memory toward fear. In another study, a historian pores over satirical fablio. Here, buffoon lords demand rights they never had, only to be mocked by clever peasants. Such jokes may have preserved memory of vulnerability. Laughter can be weapon and warning at once. Folklore scholars trace motifs: door, key, candle, decoy bed, through tales and ballads. The pattern recurs so often that absence of law feels irrelevant. Cultural memory insists on the story because it dramatizes a fear every dependent community knew, that no threshold was safe from power. The 20th century sharpens tools further. Paleography clarifies blurred words. Microfilm brings distant archives within reach. Catalogues expand access. Each advance returns the same verdict. No statute, no clause, no writ. For legal history, the record is empty. But cultural history thrives. Anthropologists compare with distant societies, noting rituals where lords symbolically claimed dominion at weddings. Psychologists argue the legend survives because it externalizes anxiety. The mind prefers a visible tyrant to diffuse systems of control. The myth is false in parchment, true in psyche. Students debate in seminars. Around oak tables scarred by decades, they argue whether silence proves innocence or concealment. One notes that in manorial accounts where every sheep is tallied, failure to note a night would be odd. Another counters that fear does not require record. Humiliation lingers in memory even if never written. A third points out how revolutions found the myth useful, preserving it in rhetoric long after medieval parchment denied it. Their quarrels echo what villagers once murmured in kitchens. Not whether it was written, but whether it was felt. Public historians bring these debates to audiences. Documentaries show close-ups of parchment under raking light, voices explaining what is absent. Reenactments stage peasants keeping vigil, not to prove intrusion, but to honor vigilance. Museums mount exhibits of satirical prints, asking viewers to reflect on how laughter defends dignity. Even in debunking, the legend gains new life. To say it never happened is still to repeat it. Every refutation engraves it deeper in cultural memory. Thus the verdict forms with two clauses. Clause 1. In the surviving record, no legal right of a lord to the first night exists. Clause 2. In imagination, in memory, in satire, in revolt, the legend thrived because it named the fear that power might cross any threshold. Both clauses are true, though in different courts. Scholars must keep them together, lest precision erase emotion, or emotion overwhelm precision. Picture again the reading room at night. Lamps glow amber, scholars close boxes, tie cords, and write final notes. One pauses, considering the weight of silence. It is a silence louder than rumor, for it resists inscription. Yet he knows silence does not erase dread. Outside, the city hums. Students leave with notebooks heavy with footnotes, but minds haunted by images of keys and doors. The verdict has been read, but the story has not ended. For ahead lies another turn, dear listener. Having passed through law and literature, archive and imagination, we step now into disciplines that study the mind itself. Psychologists and anthropologists will ask why such a legend takes root, why thresholds invite shadows, why power so often cloaks itself in stories of intrusion. The next chamber will not weigh statutes but explore symbols. Shall we open that door together? The reading room grows dim behind us, dear listener. The historians have spoken, their verdict written with careful ink. No law, no statute, no record of a right so dreadful. And yet the story does not die. It lingers, like a shadow at the edge of consciousness, whispering still. Why? Because the legend does not belong only to parchment or to theatre. It belongs to the mind. To understand its endurance, we must step into the quieter but deeper chambers of psychology, where myth is less a document than a mirror. Imagine a small lecture hall in the early 20th century. A psychologist addresses students about collective fear. On the chalkboard, he sketches a door, a key, and a looming figure. He explains, communities project anxiety onto symbols. A door is not only wood, it is safety. A key is not only metal, it is autonomy. When people fear power may cross the threshold, they imagine it as intrusion into the most private space. The first night becomes an image of all dependency condensed into a single violation. The myth thrives because it pictures what words struggle to say. Vulnerability made visible. Dream analysis joins the conversation. A psychoanalyst notes how often patients dream of weddings mixed with fear, a chamber invaded, a bed crowded by strangers, a vow threatened. The analyst argues the legend draws strength from such unconscious images. It personifies anxiety that no joy is free from danger, no intimacy safe from intrusion. In this sense, the first night is not history, but dream made communal. It is the nightmare a whole society has chosen to remember. Anthropologists expand the lens. They compare the legend with rituals elsewhere. Lords symbolically stepping across thresholds, chiefs demanding tokens from brides, priests blessing beds with gestures both protective and intrusive. These acts do not constitute the law of a night, but they show how power often announces itself at the door of fertility. Across cultures, authority gravitates to thresholds where private life begins. The legend exaggerates this truth into an absolute, translating scattered gestures into a single terrifying rite. Consider how memory works. Villagers pass stories across generations not only to explain the world but to warn the young. A grandmother might not care whether a parchment ever existed. She cares that her granddaughter grows alert, cautious, ready to defend dignity. Thus the story persists because it trains vigilance. From a psychological view, myth functions less as fact and more as rehearsal. Communities practice fear through stories so they can practice resistance in life. Scholars of trauma add another layer. They argue that the legend condenses centuries of humiliation into one scene. Whether peasants paid crushing taxes, bowed under labor, or endured insults, they remembered the sum as a night when power entered even the bedroom. Trauma prefers images that speak quickly. The Lord in the chamber is such an image. Instant, potent, unforgettable. It gathers all oppression into a single picture, easy to tell, hard to forget. There is also projection of desire and guilt. Some interpreters suggest the legend gave communities a way to speak obliquely about sexuality, fidelity, and temptation. By blaming a lord's intrusion, villagers could disguise their own anxieties about chastity or betrayal. In this sense, the myth provided a socially safe outlet for fears that could not be confessed directly. It was less about what lords did, and more about what ordinary people feared they themselves might do, or fail to prevent. Notice how the symbols repeat. The door, safety threatened. The key, autonomy stolen. The bed, intimacy exposed. These are universal images, powerful because everyone understands them without instruction. A single tale containing these elements will outlive a dozen statutes. The mind remembers pictures more than arguments. That is why the legend endures, even when scholars erase it from law books. Psychology explains what parchment cannot. Fear survives because symbols thrive. In the mid-20th century, cultural theorists describe the legend as a social dream. It is not an error, but a window into collective imagination. Just as individuals interpret nightmares for hidden meaning, societies interpret myths to understand themselves. The first night is society's nightmare about unchecked power. Its persistence shows not gullibility, but wisdom. Communities knew that telling the nightmare kept its lesson alive, and still the legend adapts. In modern counseling, patients speak of inherited anxieties, fears passed from grandparents to grandchildren. The legend appears again, not as fact, but as metaphor. A young bride nervous on her wedding night may never have heard of medieval lords, but she feels echoes of the same dread. That intimacy makes one vulnerable, that promises can be broken by stronger hands. Myth resonates because psyche repeats. Thus we see, dear listener, that the story's endurance lies not in lore but in mind. It is a mirror reflecting the deepest concerns of human life. The fragility of intimacy, the reach of power, the need to guard thresholds both wooden and emotional. Historians may call it false, but psychologists call it true in another register. The legend endures because it tells us something about ourselves we are unwilling to forget. And so the journey continues. From stage to archive to psyche, the myth has travelled far. But it has one more transformation awaiting. It will echo in modern culture, in novels and films, in political rhetoric and casual speech. It will surface whenever people seek an image for violation of trust or intrusion of power. That is where we go next, into modern echoes, where the legend proves it has never truly died. The lecture hall of psychology fades, dear listener, but the story does not rest. Having passed through parchment and psyche, it steps now into the crowded avenues of the modern world. Here, memory takes new disguises. The rumour that once whispered in kitchens and resounded on opera stages now slips into novels, films, debates, even casual speech. The legend of the Lord's first night has become a symbol ready to serve wherever people need an image for intrusion, violation, or unchecked power. These are its modern echoes. Picture a bookshelf in the 19th century, later reprinted for today's readers. Historical novels, eager for atmosphere, insert the legend as if it were fact. The author describes a lord demanding the bride, the groom powerless, the villagers outraged. No footnote interrupts. Readers absorb the scene as history. A century later, screenwriters borrow the trope. In dimly lit castles on black and white film, brides shiver, villains sneer, and audiences gasp. The myth survives by entertaining, passing easily from romance to horror to melodrama. Its factual emptiness matters little. Its emotional clarity matters much. Politicians find use for it too. In speeches railing against tyranny, reformers invoke the first night as shorthand for total power over the powerless. They say, just as once lords claimed the bride, so now corporations, dictators, or foreign occupiers claim rights that do not belong to them. The audience does not pause to ask whether medieval law recorded such things. They nod, stirred by the image. The myth has become metaphor, a tool sharpened for rhetoric. In literature of the 20th century, the legend appears as allegory. Playwrights use it to explore betrayal. Philosophers cite it to illustrate alienation. Novelists place it in historical backdrops to magnify injustice. Each time the power lies not in accuracy, but in recognition. Readers know immediately what is meant. Intimacy stolen by force, dignity mocked by intrusion. The symbol works because it is simple, brutal, unforgettable. Cinema amplifies the echo further. In epics about medieval kingdoms, a villainous noble threatens the bride, while a hero saves her in the final act. In dark art house films, the legend surfaces as nightmare sequence, a metaphor for patriarchy or state violence. Even comedies parody the idea, proving its ubiquity. Audiences leave theatres remembering not the footnotes of historians, but the shadows on screen. Images prove stronger than erasures. Everyday speech preserves the echo too. A scandal in politics is described as a new droit de cuissage. A corporation accused of overreach is likened to a lord at a threshold. Journalists use the phrase not to report medieval fact, but to dramatize modern outrage. The legend has become idiom, an easy phrase for intrusion. Even when writers know it never existed as law, they use it because it delivers meaning instantly. Notice how technology multiplies the effect. Online debates quote the legend freely. Memes depict shadowy lords at doors. Essays circulate comparing medieval myth to modern abuses. The digital world, hungry for vivid shorthand, finds in the first night an inexhaustible resource. What once lived in whispers now spreads in seconds across continents. The echo grows louder, not fainter. This persistence reveals something profound. Myths do not die when disproved. They evolve. The very act of historians declaring the legend false gave it new publicity. To refute is to repeat. Each article saying it never happened reintroduces it to fresh readers. Modern culture thrives on such paradox. Debunking and perpetuation walk hand in hand. The legend also shapes art subtly. Painters of the 20th century create canvases of looming shadows at thresholds, not captioned as Jus Primae Noctis, but recognizable all the same. Photographers stage symbolic images, doors half open, figures blurred, couples guarded. Even fashion borrows hints, wedding gowns marketed with slogans about autonomy and protection, resonating unconsciously with fears the legend dramatized. Culture recycles symbols even when origins are forgotten. What, then, do these echoes teach us? They reveal that societies crave images that simplify complex anxieties. A single night, a single door, a single abuse. These condense centuries of inequality into a vivid emblem. The legend remains because it continues to be useful, not to law, but to imagination. It tells us quickly what it feels like when power violates privacy. That feeling is timeless, and so the story adapts to every age. And so we stand close to the end of our journey, dear listener. We have seen rumor whisper, satire mock, theatre thunder, archives fall silent, psychologists interpret, and culture echo anew. The path leads now to our final threshold. In the last chamber, we will not seek more evidence or new metaphors. We will pause, reflect, and gather what the legend has shown us about fear, dignity, and endurance. The closing reflections await. The voices we have followed grow quiet, dear listener. The rumor that once crept through kitchens, the satire that danced across wooden stages, the banners that shook in revolt, the parchments that scholars unrolled under dim lamps, the dreams that psychologists deciphered, the echoes that film and politics amplified, all of these have now fallen into stillness. What remains is reflection. At the end of our long path, we pause before the final threshold, not to open another door, but to understand why doors mattered all along. From the very beginning, the tale of the first night was never only about a single abuse. It was about fear woven into community life. A whisper said that even the most intimate vows might be broken by power. That whisper was enough to change posture, to make brides nervous, to make grooms glance at shadows, to make mothers invent small rituals of protection. Even without parchment, rumor created behavior. That is the paradox of human memory. What never lived in law can still live in muscle and in vigilance. As centuries passed, the story served many masters. A jester laughed at it, stripping tyranny of solemnity. A priest thundered against it, naming it sin so that sin might be recognized in smaller places too. Rebels shouted it, attaching a face to the faceless system of oppression. Scholars tested it, proving with careful silence that the law knew nothing of it. Psychologists turned it into metaphor, showing how communities project dread onto symbols. Politicians borrowed it, artists recycled it, ordinary people used it as shorthand. At every stage, the legend adapted because it carried a simple grammar everyone understood. A door, a key, an intruder. That grammar needed no translation. What does this reveal about us? That humans crave images more than records. Records reassure, but images teach. A ledger may tell you what tax was paid, but a rumor about a lord at your bed teaches vigilance more urgently. A myth condenses anxieties into a single picture. That is why it survives even when scholars erase it from margins. To debunk is to repeat is to preserve. The very effort to kill the myth ensured its survival. In this, the legend teaches us about the strange economy of memory. It also teaches humility. Communities lacking parchment or privilege still defended themselves with creativity. They tied bells to doors, sang long songs, kept friends nearby, turned shoes as signals. These rituals were small, but they formed invisible armor. The myth is not only about the imagined cruelty of lords, but also about the real courage of neighbors. Memory preserved the fear, but also the ingenuity. That balance is itself a form of truth. Notice, too, the lesson about symbols. Every threshold in our journey mattered. The village doorway, the stage curtain, the archive box, the therapist's mirror, the cinema screen, all were thresholds where imagination stepped from one world to another. The legend taught us that life is built of such thresholds. Each of us stands daily at doors of choice, intimacy, trust, power. Each of us holds keys that must be used wisely. Myths endure because they dramatize what is constant, the need to guard what matters most. And so, as we close this tale, what remains to be said? That the Lord's first night never existed as law, but always existed as warning. That the absence in documents is not an erasure, but a kind of silence full of meaning. That communities across centuries rehearsed vigilance by retelling the nightmare. That even false stories can keep true lessons alive. Perhaps that is the secret the legend wanted to leave us. Do not mistake documents for destiny, nor rumors for nothing. Both shape how people live. Picture the final scene. A castle on a hill fades into silhouette. A cottage below glows with steady firelight. Inside, a family closes the door, sets down a key, and sings softly as night gathers. In another room, centuries later, a scholar ties a box shut and writes a note. No evidence, but much fear. In another, a filmmaker closes a script with a half-open door drawn on the last page. In another, you and I sit here, in this quiet hour, reflecting on what the story has revealed. Across all these rooms, across all these centuries, the myth continues its work, not to deceive, but to remind. Now, dear listener, I thank you. Thank you for walking this long path of whispers and shadows, of laughter and revolt, of silence and echoes. If these reflections gave you insight, let them also give you rest. If the telling kept you company, consider leaving a small sign of your presence. A like, a subscription, or a gentle promise to return. The legend will not vanish. Legends rarely do. But for tonight, we let it sleep. May your thresholds be safe, your doors your own, and your keys always fit the locks you choose.